You're listening to Nutrition Matters podcast with Paige Smathers, registered dietitian nutritionist. Hey everyone, it's Paige, your favorite nutrition podcaster and dietitian. Nutrition Matters podcast explores what really matters in nutrition and health with a sensitive and realistic approach. This podcast relies on the support of listeners like you and needs donations to keep this project running. To help support the podcast, please consider making a donation at pagesmothersrd.com/podcast. If you find this episode interesting, engaging, or helpful in your life, please consider donating, sharing with friends and family, and leaving a review on iTunes. You can leave a review about this podcast straight from your podcast app. Search Nutrition Matters Podcast, click Reviews, and then write a review. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook at Paige Smathers RD if you'd like to have a little more food for thought. Thank you for listening. Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Nutrition Matters Podcast. My name is Paige Smathers and I'm your host. And as always, I'm so glad you're here. This particular episode of Nutrition Matters Podcast, I feel is just so incredibly filled with so many great things that will help you in your relationship with food. And I'm just ecstatic that I had the chance to sit down with one of my favorite registered dietitians, Emily Fonsbeck, who happens to be a dietitian in Utah. So we actually live around about 4 hours from each other. And we've gotten to know each other over the years online, and we've actually never met in person. But even though we've never met in person, I'd really consider Emily one of my good friends and someone that I really respect professionally. And I just think the world of her. So I was so grateful that she was willing to come on the podcast for another time. We mentioned in this episode that she's been on quite a few times, especially toward the beginning. And I will be republishing some of those episodes along with many of the other ones I did in the beginning on a monthly basis. So this episode focuses all about her experience with orthorexia, how she worked through it, and then some ideas she has in how to approach health in a way that really actually promotes true health, in a way that kind of doesn't create obsession and rigidity, but creates overall stability and just peace within your life. So this episode, I feel, is a really good one to share with friends and family if they're not quite understanding why you aren't dieting or why you are working on your own journey with body positivity. This episode might help people sort of understand why, in addition to some of the other ones we've done with talking about normal eating and also exploring weight neutrality. I'm trying to produce a lot of episodes these days that will be helpful for you to be able to share so that people can understand where you might be coming from. So before we get into that, I just want to share a few things that you might want to be aware of. The first is in the spring, I will be putting on an all-day workshop in Salt Lake City all about mindful eating with my friend Noah Rasheta. And I'm really excited about this. This is going to be so fantastic. We're pouring a lot of work into this, and it's just going to be such a great day full of all kinds of education and information and practical ways to apply mindfulness to your relationship with food. So head on over to my website, pagesmothersrd.com/workshop to check out the details. This will be a Saturday in the spring, and at the time that I'm recording this, I'm just not positive exactly if we have the date nailed down, but by the time you're listening to this, everything will be up on the website, and so check that out and see if it might be a good fit for what you're looking for. Maybe fly into Salt Lake, go skiing, if we still have snow in the spring at that point. If not, go hiking around beautiful Salt Lake, kind of visit, or if you're local, obviously that's a lot of fun too. As always, I want to make sure you know about my Facebook group for the podcast. It's Nutrition Matters Podcast Community. This is just a place you can go to kind of interact with like-minded people and also have a place to be able to ask questions about particular episodes. If you like what you hear on the podcast and you want to kind of take things deeper, but you're not sure how to do that, you're welcome to check out my distance coaching offerings. You can apply at pagesmothersrd.com/individuals. Or if you would like to look into the online course to see if that might be a good fit for you, that's just pagesmothersrd.com/course, which is all online and you can do it from anywhere in the world. All right, I think that's about it. And with that, let's just take a moment to introduce Emily Fonsbeck to you in case you don't know her already. So Emily is a registered dietitian in Southern Utah, St. George specifically. She focuses her work on helping people recover from eating disorders, chronic dieting, disordered eating. She's the mom of 3 children and a soon-to-be 4th child. She has so many things to share about her life personally and also professionally. And that's really what we dive into today in this conversation. And I really hope you enjoy it. I sure did. So take a listen. Well, Emily, thanks so much for joining me on Nutrition Matters podcast, and welcome back for the 3rd time. Is this the 3rd or 4th? No, this is the 4th time you've been on the podcast.
Yeah, I'm the lucky one. I'm so glad to be here. Love the podcast.
Thanks, Emily.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. You're welcome. Okay, so all my listeners who've listened for a while will know that I've gone through and I have deleted the first 30-ish episodes of the podcast, and then I'm republishing a few of my favorites kind of every month to kind of bring those back up into the queue, into the higher levels of the queue, because I have way more listeners now than I did in the beginning. So some of your older episodes that you've done with me will kind of be recycled back in. So some people this might be their very first time meeting you in the podcast, and others might know you really well. So just take a minute and give people kind of an idea of who you are and what you do, and then we'll dive into your story a little bit. Okay, great. So I'm a registered dietitian located in Southern Utah, St. George, more specifically. I have been a dietitian now, I guess, for 12 years. I've been in private practice for 6, so half of that. And work primarily with disordered eating and eating disorders, helping individuals make peace with food and their bodies. So working with body image as well. I didn't start out that way, though. When I first started practicing, I was very diet-minded and actually worked at a weight loss resort. And through my own personal and professional experiences, that definitely changed, took a full 180 in the other direction to be more weight neutral and, all foods fit philosophy with food. Yeah. So for anybody who's kind of in this world of listening to this genre of podcasts, you've done a lot of interviews about your experience struggling with orthorexia. So let's just quickly talk about orthorexia, what it is, what that experience was like for you, and kind of the highlights of how you kind of worked through that for yourself. Sure. Well, so I guess to first start out, orthorexia, the definition. Yeah, please. Yeah, and then maybe we could talk about that. Yeah, that's great. So, it directly translates to perfect eating. It was a term coined by Dr. Stephen Bratman, who actually suffered from it himself and realized that this was disordered and a problem, and came to kind of understand what his issues were, what the underlying triggers were, and then, of course, coined this term. It's not a clinically diagnosed eating disorder, but it's rampant in our society. And a lot of people really identify with orthorexia when they may not identify with other types of eating disorders. So it's such a helpful term, I think, in helping people understand that really pathologizing this obsession with perfect eating or the perfect diet or seeking out, the perfect way of eating. So the individuals who struggle with this mostly just feel really preoccupied and obsessed with clean, pure foods. And to the point where it's become so restrictive that it's actually unhealthy. So it's this great paradox, right? So as we're pursuing health, it actually takes away physical and mental health. So some of the hallmark signs is just a real obsession and fixation with perfect eating. It becomes difficult to eat out or go on vacation or eat with other people. When they go against one of their rules, there's extreme anxiety. They often are researching food an inordinate amount of time.
So yeah, it's obviously very preoccupying.
And it's just so tricky because, first of all, this is not very clear to the average person that this is a problem, right? In a lot of ways in our society, this is very praised and glorified and kind of made to seem like, oh, this is you're just so healthy. And in a lot of cases, you get praised by the people around you, kind of saying, good for you. You're so awesome. I wish I had your dedication, your discipline, so on. And so it can be really difficult to identify that this is actually problematic, even though it might be completely detracting from your social life, or you eat completely different foods from your family, or you can't live like a normal, kind of happy, well-balanced person. It can be difficult to identify just because other people around you seem to think that it's such a great thing you're doing.
That is such a good point. It's totally glamorized. I mean, I know that was absolutely my experience. Was the praise I got actually only encouraged it, right? Like willpower and self-control. And it was really easy for me to kind of fly under the radar because I was a dietitian, and that's, I don't know, maybe the expectation, right? So we all are supposed to be kind of anal about what we eat. But you're right, exactly. It's so glamorized. It's so socially normal, culturally acceptable to be overthinking food, to have lists of foods we don't eat or do eat, for one health or wellness reason or another. Not even so much a diet or weight loss or anything. It can be all about just pursuing this idea of health. And that's the interesting thing about orthorexia is clinically it looks much less about weight and more about that strive for perfect eating. Although I will say in recovery, I think that some of the anxiety about weight gain does come up for sure with these individuals. And a lot of that has probably to do with like feeling out of control, which a lot of it is at the root, that perfectionistic, controlling way to control anxiety for sure.
And what's so interesting about orthorexia to me is, you and I, because of what we do professionally, see different iterations of what orthorexia can look like in different people. And I'll tell you what, no two people restrict the same exact things, right? And if you spend enough time on the internet, you can find a reason to not eat any food. Like any food you can find, oh gosh, I should never eat broccoli again because of such and such reason. So you can see how this can really get out of control, especially in our current environment where we have the internet and social media, and like all our friends are doing different diets. You can get to the point where you literally can recall something you've read or researched or learned about of a reason to be afraid of anything.
Yes.
So
yes, yeah, like even so-called healthy or nutritious foods. None of it makes sense. It makes sense to the person, but you're right. It's so different from person to person, and the level of the extremeness of it can vary from people to people. But the issue is still there. It's still the issue of just that anxiety about food that literally will affect every other area of your life.
So for you personally, was this sort of part of your personality that got kind of more and more intense as you went to school and as you started practicing, or how did this look for you sort of in general?
That's a good question, actually. I would say my personality type is very much a perfectionist. So it was probably it was a breeding ground for sure. But I made it through my education pretty unscathed. Like I actually feel like I had a pretty healthy relationship with food as a nutrition student. I have 3 children. I'm pregnant with our 4th. And I actually gave birth to our first the day after I finished my internship. My dietetics internship. So that's I think what started it. This new life event. I went from full-time student, full-time working to stay-at-home mom, and that transition was really difficult for me. And so that's I think where it started. I didn't go straight into orthorexia at that time. It was more about just my body had changed. I was feeling the same societal pressures that most postpartum women feel. body image wise. I just was so overwhelmed with this new baby and my new position as mom, and
lots of changes, lots of transitions.
Totally, yeah. And that's, I think, just what I didn't handle well. And I was so busy with finishing an internship. I don't know that I prepared myself very well, which, in hindsight is what it is. But I really was struggling. And what I started doing was just controlling what I ate more, exercising more, eating less. And I stayed there. I stayed probably in what I call functional dysfunctional eating for about 5 years. Like it probably was very culturally normal. It was very easy for me to kind of, engage in these behaviors that felt a little bit preoccupying and obsessive. But most people, like you say, would praise that. And that's definitely what happened to me. So I stayed there for about 5 years until right after we brought home our second son, he through adoption, actually. And that was a big life change as well. And then a lot of the physical effects of not eating enough and exercising way too much really started to catch up with me. And so I started getting into a lot of like elimination protocols that most people do when they're looking for answers for these physical symptoms,
so
right?
Like stomach aches, headaches, kind of this just sort of like symptoms that who knows what they are.
Exactly. Yeah. Headaches for sure, digestive issues, just lack of energy. And so, I definitely started these elimination protocols because, I felt like what I was fighting was inflammation, which maybe was true. It was probably just inflammation because I wasn't eating enough and I was exercising too much. But I saw it as, well, I need to eliminate XYZ in order to heal my gut or to get rid of these physical symptoms. And once I find my trigger, then I'll be fine.
And that is so in right now. People are, this was years ago that you were in this mindset, but I feel like it's only gotten worse. Don't you think?
Oh, heavens. Yes.
It's everywhere.
Mm-hmm. And again, it's so natural to kind of think that way. Like, I have this issue, I'm going to blame it on food. Not necessarily the behaviors or the anxiety about food or any of those things. It's like so black and white. So clear cut, right? Like, cut this out and you'll be fine. So that's where I was. And I definitely did that. And it was just a rabbit hole for me, given my just the perfect storm of issues, my personality traits, and then, of course, my physical symptoms, and environmentally, the culture we all live in was just a breeding ground for orthorexia. And I just eliminated until I was probably down to 5 or 6 foods I'd allow myself to eat, which totally made sense in my head, of course, of why I was, eating the way I was eating. But obviously it didn't make sense. Anyone could probably see, like, you don't feel good because you're not eating enough, right?
And the answer is not more restriction.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what's so interesting is I have just so come to know from my own experience personally, which is why I feel so passionate professionally, that inclusion of all foods and a variety of them is absolutely what makes me feel my best, physically, mentally, emotionally. Like, I was in such a bad place in all of those areas with so much restriction. It was never the answer. And so by including, all foods and learning how to, alternative coping skills for my perfectionism and anxiety, I really found my way out of it.
What were some of those coping mechanisms for you that worked?
Well, so my husband obviously is the one that noticed the most. And so one night he said, Emily, this is just not you. Like, this is not you. You've got to get some help. And he reminds me, he told me that like a year earlier and I wasn't hearing it. But apparently I was in a place that I was willing to hear that. And it was actually very validating to have someone from the outside say, I think that you've got a problem. And he actually pulled up a webpage explaining orthorexia. And he's like, I've been doing a little digging and I think this is what you have. And it was just so validating to me to feel like, I was at this place where I was just so ready to do something different. Somewhere deep in my heart or my mind, it just really resonated with me. So he encouraged me to seek out a therapist. And so I did actually that night. It was like a Saturday night, and I called her and she answered. And I didn't expect to. I expected just to leave a message and hear back from her Monday. But I actually think that was divine intervention, because I don't know if things would have changed by Monday and I would have been in a different place. And I was ready, and we set an appointment, and I saw her, and she was such a blessing to me. In helping me with the perfectionism. I actually didn't talk to her a lot about food, which may surprise some. We talked a lot. There was such a big part of me that just knew if I could overcome this intense desire to always be perfect, that I wouldn't struggle so much with food. And so that's a lot of what we worked on. And so a lot of it was changing my mindset to be more self-compassionate rather than self-punishing. Especially if I made a mistake, right? My immediate response is to beat myself up and be critical. And so I just really just practiced, self-compassion and being kinder to myself. A big one was, and this is actually a hallmark of someone who struggles with orthorexia, they tend to feel a lot of superiority for their eating choices, which is actually something that's really hard for me to admit, because that goes against so much of what I value. But that's where I was. And so a big thing we worked on was not comparing myself to other people, which is actually so good, because now, years later, I feel like that's one of my biggest strengths. I worked so hard to train my mind to just not compare myself to other people, to just, she called it holding your seat. So she'd say, just remember to hold your seat, not get too high, not get too low, just, hold your seat. And that was my mantra, hold my seat. Brene Brown says, I think something like hold your sacred space or something. It's similar, that idea of, you're not better, you're not worse, it's just you. And that was huge for me. It was such a great skill for me to learn, to validate myself without feeling the need to compare.
Isn't it interesting? I just want to cut in here and say,
sure.
It fascinates me how, our struggles with food or bodies kind of is this physical manifestation of something that's going on with us, or something we need to learn, something that a weakness we have that's sort of showing itself in how we care for ourselves, whether that's restriction or obsession with healthy eating or finding yourself binging. This tends to be sort of okay, what's going, a sign of what's going on with you, that you can learn this super valuable lesson that's super abstract and difficult to learn unless and until you have something very physical and practical and necessary in your face to work on, right? So sometimes food can be this beautiful way to learn self-compassion and trust and nourishment and, interdependence and connection and all of these really big things that it's tough to learn unless you have a reason. And sometimes your reason is, gosh, I'm noticing that I'm super dysfunctional in this particular way with food.
Yes, exactly. I absolutely think of it that way. Food is my teacher, and I would not go back and change a thing. It taught me so much. This struggle taught me so much, and I wouldn't be who I am without it. And I mean, essentially what I think we're getting at is it just helped me better connect with what I truly value. So I was able to bring my behaviors in line with what I value, because there was a discrepancy. And it really just taught me to connect back to be true to myself and true to what I believe and what I value. And that is, it's about the food and it's not about the food, right? It's about so much more. Now, on the food side, I wouldn't say that wasn't its own piece as well. I actually didn't seek the help of a registered dietitian. I actually think I was just feeling so much shame and hypocrisy for not having this figured out as a registered dietitian that I just didn't feel comfortable reaching out. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend that to anyone, but I did, I was pretty strong with myself and putting myself on a meal plan and kind of encouraging myself to challenge foods. And all those things. And it was a struggle. I mean, definitely so hard. And it would have been a lot easier with the help of a professional, I'm sure. But it worked. It was, just something that I kind of had to work through on my own. And I learned a lot in the process, which actually I think was a valuable tool in what I do now, obviously. But a lot of that, I actually think that so much of and this is true, I think, for any disordered eating or eating disorder, we are much stronger mentally when we're fueling physically. And so it was easier for me to tackle some of those mental and emotional issues when I was eating consistently, regularly, and adequately. And really just practicing mindful eating and intuitive eating practices. So
I love that. We're much stronger mentally when we're fueling physically. That's awesome. I love that. Mm-hmm. And so true. And yeah, I know that you're a very outspoken kind of advocate of let's make sure that we're not just like going on elimination diets before we're exploring, what's the real purpose to the stomach ache or the headache or the fatigue or whatever. And yeah, in some cases, it's a sign of something going on with you physiologically and something that just doesn't agree well with your body. But in a lot of cases, and this is true for me, in my practice as well, like I've seen people who start really working on eating a wide variety of foods and really trying to develop a healthier approach to them, and notice how so much of that gets so much better. And they're just always shocked, like, whoa, I thought I was going to have to cut out X, Y, and Z food, but really I needed to eat more. So it's your story is a good example of that.
Yeah, and I actually think that's a good clarification, just to be inclusive of a wide variety of stories. Obviously, I'm sharing mine, and everyone will have a different one. And sure, there may be cases where maybe not all foods do fit because of an allergy or a diagnosis or whatever. But overwhelmingly, absolutely, I believe that the anxiety about the food causes more symptoms than the food ever will. And so if that is the issue, if we can clear out that anxiety and fear, so much of the tolerance is already there. We can tolerate those foods. And that was my personal story. Absolutely. Like, I made all of it up, like all these intolerances, all these foods that I felt like I couldn't handle, that really, honestly, it felt like I was having a physical symptom as a result of eating it, was really just the anxiety about it. It wasn't the food at all. And that's what I've come to know.
Were you able to see that in the moment? Like, were you able to identify, gosh, this is my anxiety personified in this way? Or I think what really was helpful for me is I had gotten to, like, I was eating so few foods, and I feel like I'd hit rock bottom in a lot of ways, physically and mentally and emotionally, that it was almost like, I don't really care if I'm having this physical symptom from this food, because because what's my other option? To cut it out and go back where I was before? I was feeling horrible then. I just really wanted to work through and keep this open mind to the possibility that maybe if I just worked on this perfectionism, I found alternative ways to cope with anxiety, I thought more positively and less judgmentally about food, that I could get to a place where I could eat all foods. And maybe that was a real blessing. Maybe that was just something that was put in my heart to kind of lead me towards what was going to be true for me. And in a lot of ways, I believe that. But it kept me going. Like, it was almost like it almost felt like if I felt like I had a physical symptom from a food, I was at a crossroads. So I cut it out or I keep eating it. And my resolution really was just like, I'm not willing to go the other way. I hated everything about that restriction. And I just want to find something different. And I'm going to trust and have faith that there's, a better answer. And that's the one positive of hitting rock bottom, is that you're so convinced that you don't want to go back, that it can be a motivator to continue forward even when things get really hard, and so totally. Yeah, there's some advantages of that, even though it can feel like such a failure, or you can talk to yourself, in such negative ways about how did I get here? What is wrong with me? And all this self-doubt and criticism. But if you can kind of recognize, like, this might actually in and of itself be very purposeful and very helpful in my recovery, I think that's kind of a nice way to look at it too.
Well, and I think for any listeners, maybe something to do, an exercise I actually often have my clients do, is to write down what recovery looks like for them. You know, in an ideal world, how would you want to interact with food? What would you want to think about if you weren't thinking about food all of the time? What would you want to do if you weren't planning your meals all the time? And just really start thinking about, like, what does recovery look like for me? And that's what kept me going. Like I wanted to be able to go eat ice cream with my kids if they wanted ice cream. I wanted to be able to go travel without any anxiety about what I was going to eat. And I knew for me, in order to get there, I couldn't stay in that restrictive mindset with any food. And so it kept me going. It kept me kind of pulled towards, this is what I want. This is what I want my relationship to be with food. And there was obviously times where I doubted, like, well, am I being overconfident, or, you know, is it too positive to think that I could really eat anything? Is that too good to be true? And I would just say for any listener, that wasn't too good to be true for me. You know, as I really kept in mind what my goals were and what I wanted my relationship with food to be like, I was able to get there. So maybe something to try.
Love that idea. Thank you. So what does your eating and life look like for you now? I love how, I mean, to me, it's almost like the story comes full circle, just because here you are pregnant, and you started your story talking about how your delivery of your first baby kind of started this whole kind of road, right? And so here you are pregnant again for the second time with your fourth baby. And I just wonder, like, how are you thinking about having this baby and how life will change in this transition? Like, how are you doing that with this mindset and kind of where you've come to after all these years?
Good question. Well, what I would say first is I absolutely believe that full recovery is possible for anyone. But I think that comes with some boundaries, you know, to protect yourself. So a lot of that means, like, you know, social media boundaries, or the kind of talk you know, the way you talk about food, or the way you interact with it. Like, there's ways that you can protect yourself with setting certain boundaries in recovery. And so, like, I'm very aware, actually, I actually think a couple stories may help with this. So I had our 12-year-old, he was biological. We brought our 5-year-old or our 7-year-old home through adoption here domestically in the United States. And then our 3-year-old, we actually just brought home last December from Korea. And that was a huge transition. Like, a 3-year-old who doesn't speak English, or 2.5, she was 2.5 at the time, that doesn't speak English, new country, new family. I mean, it was a huge transition for her. And it went a lot better than we had actually anticipated, which is huge. She's doing really well. But it was a huge life change. And I actually could feel some of those just inklings of eating disorder voice come back in, you know, just as a way to control and manage anxiety or worry about certain situations. And it was good for me. It was good for me to remember, and just remember that I'm stronger. Like, I can connect with my healthy mind, not my eating disorder mind, and stay on top of it. And so it was fine. It was actually a good experience for me to kind of recognize that it's recovery is ongoing. You know, if that was a struggle for you, it could be this perfect set of circumstances to put you back in it. So you've just got to be vigilant about it. It's interesting now, though, here I am pregnant, surprisingly, with this fourth baby. And I actually have been thinking about this because I'm planning on writing a blog post about it. I probably had the best body image of my life being pregnant. And I don't think it obviously has nothing to do with getting smaller, obviously getting bigger, which I think is important to recognize, that, you know, positive body image has nothing to do with body size and or weight or whatever, and everything to do with gratitude. Like, I am overwhelmed with gratitude for the opportunity to do this again. I am loving every minute of it. I can't wait to have this baby here. Like, for 12 years, I wanted to be pregnant again, and here I am. And I really think that gratitude is such a big part of this. Like, I feel so grateful for what my body is doing, that I'm just in such a good place, body image wise. And so, you know, in terms of food, I actually just recently, put on the blog a it was a blog post about a couple of recipes, chocolate chip cookie recipes that we really love. And I had pictures of one of them. I didn't have pictures of the other one. It was an oatmeal chocolate chip cookie recipe. So we got the ingredients, and my 3-year-old and I made them one afternoon. And as I was typing up the blog post with these pictures, this recipe calls for shortening. I'm creaming this shortening and sugar together. And it never once occurred to me that I maybe shouldn't put it on the blog because of something someone might think about a dietitian posting a recipe with shortening, or like any sort of judgment I had about eating them. Or it really was just like this place where I was just like, 5 years ago, I would have felt torn up inside about this. I haven't even thought about it. And that's where yeah, exactly. Like, that's where I just feel like sometimes I have these moments like that where I realize how far I've come and how much like exponentially better my life is in so many areas because of the healing I've done with food. So I don't know if that gives you a picture.
That does. That's great. I mean, those are great stories.
Positive mindset and just feeling a lot better body image wise. So
that's so great. Thanks for sharing all of that. And your blog is so awesome. I'm glad you've kind of referred to it. I just love the stuff you put out there. And I think it's just so full of such great information that really is so practical, and you're such a good writer. A few of your latest blog posts have really stood out to me and really resonated with me. So in light of the conversation we're having about pregnancy, let's just kind of run with that theme for a second. So pregnancy is famous for cravings. People think, ice cream and pickles and what else? I don't know. There's other famous cravings that people think of during pregnancy. So have you experienced cravings? And also, I would love to hear you talk about your ideas from your blog post that was called like talking through the wisdom of your cravings. What are your thoughts on cravings and their wisdom?
Yes. Well, I think that is my position, is cravings do have wisdom. We tend to have so many judgments about cravings, right? And we usually attribute it to lack of willpower, self-control, or even emotional eating. I'm craving this, so I must be emotional or whatever. When really they can just be deep-seated wisdom. As far as pregnancy, one thing I have noticed is I love orange juice. I've never been that big of an orange juice fan, but I love orange juice, and I love to have a little with most every meal. And it just is super refreshing, and especially in the first trimester where I was feeling a lot of queasiness, it just felt really fresh and kind of just nice way to end the meal and not feel nauseous after. So I have this theory, though, that because my iron levels are normal without taking iron. I don't take an iron supplement in my prenatal, and my iron levels are normal. And I have this theory that my orange juice consumption is increasing iron absorption from my meals. And so if I had judgments about drinking orange juice, I may be missing out on the nourishing effects that it's having on me, right? So that's one example from pregnancy. But in general, I think that our cravings have wisdom. I think there's a lot of things they could be telling you. I would say overwhelmingly, a lot of times cravings come because of inadequate nutrition.
Totally.
So we're not eating, so we're just not eating enough food in general, or enough, like particularly like macronutrients. Like maybe we're restricting carbohydrates or fat or protein or whatever it is because of a certain elimination diet or diet plan or meal plan. And it can easily lead into cravings. And so when someone's feeling craving for a specific food, I think it's good to look at like what's in that food and what is that maybe telling you? And have you been restricting in that way? When we're actually in the presence of a calorie or carbohydrate restriction, whether acute or chronically, so during the day or over the span of a few days or weeks or months, Paige, I'm sure that our brains actually make neurotransmitters that increase impulses to go get something to eat, particularly something high in calories and carbohydrates. And so there's a lot of adaptive responses because our bodies are primed for survival. It's instinctive. We want to feel satisfied from food, physiologically and psychologically. And so if we're if we're avoiding satisfaction because we equate it with overeating, then it's easy for those adaptive responses to build in.
And to feel really out of control, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the more you ignore, the stronger they come, because that's just your body trying to say, hey, mm-hmm. we're starving, or we're hungry, or there's inadequate carbohydrate on board, so please go ahead and eat that donut,
Right.
Yeah, I think that that's overwhelmingly the majority of what I see as well. And a lot of times it's this acute kind of daily inadequate mm-hmm. nutrition that hits people in the afternoon, right? Where it's like tiny little breakfast, if anything, super wimpy lunch, and then they're surprised that in the afternoon they're just like reaching for whatever is available in the office or at school or in whatever setting or at home. And so caring for yourself at each and every meal and leaving each meal feeling satisfied, if you do that, so a lot of people notice like, oh, I don't have that same drive to go like, crazy on whatever you're seeing, although you still might have like, oh, I want that Twix or that cookie, because that's normal to have a little something that you want. But if it feels really like, ooh, I just gotta have it, sometimes that's a good kind of first thing to look at. Maybe you mm-hmm. aren't eating enough.
Right. So inadequate nutrition, I think you brought up another really good point there, though, with cravings, which is sometimes you just want a cookie. Sometimes you just want a Twix.
And it doesn't mean anything.
And it doesn't mean anything. You might just be overthinking it. Right. Yeah. And so I think it just sounds good to eat. Probably don't need to think too much about that. But yeah, overwhelmingly, I think inadequate fuel. Another thing I think that's really common is that feeling of food insecurity. Like if I don't know it's going to be there tomorrow because of some sort of self-imposed restriction, I could easily build into I have to have all of it right now.
The scarcity thing is huge. And what do right. diets do? They make us develop this relationship with food where we believe that it's scarce, even though we know in the back of our minds, I can always go and get that whenever I want it. In your mind, it's scarce, and we're programmed to eat a lot of food when we know it's scarce.
Right. Again, it's instinctive, survival. It can feel really compulsive. Like I think a lot of these behaviors can feel really compulsive, but again, that's because of that adaptation to whatever perceived threat you're having. So inadequate nutrition, or maybe it's food insecurity or that feeling of scarcity. So yeah, I think another one in regards to that is that variety piece. So if you're eating the same things over and over and over again, you're going to get really bored of it and you're going to feel cravings. And that's a meal plan and that's a diet plan to a T usually, is we're just eating the same thing over and over and over again. So to branch out, exactly, yeah. Our body wants to see more variety than that. So it can tell you a lot of things, I think is the general message.
Yeah, and also just this kind of fundamental approach toward a craving where you're not afraid of it. You're looking at it as, okay, this is telling me something, this is teaching me something, and if I just kind of don't judge it and just look at it, maybe I'll learn something about how to care for myself with more kindness and kind of fulfillment and satisfaction or something.
Absolutely. Yeah, that curiosity is huge.
Yeah.
For sure.
Okay, so I really am excited to talk to you about one other blog post that you did where you talked about how to kind of care about your eating without really caring at all. And this really ties into the whole conversation we've had so far with your history and what you specialize in professionally. And also this, I think it does tie in really well to this quote that you've also posted from the World Health Organization. Tell us about this quote really quick. How did you come across it?
Well, I was actually doing a KSL article on competent eating. So Ellen Satter's
Love it.
competent eating model. Yeah.
So, and for the listeners, I just published an episode all about that. That's episode awesome. 90. Yeah. So check back with that. Okay.
Oh, good. Yeah. Good.
So reference for another episode.
Yeah, that's good, because it's a really great concept that I think people need to understand. And
it's evidence-based.
Absolutely.
It's validated scientifically.
So I was researching for that, and somehow in a Google search, I just came across this link to the World Health Organization that was talking about health promotion. And so the article was about health promotion, and this was the quote. Do you want me to read it?
Yeah, please.
So the quote, it says, to reach a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, an individual or group must be able to identify and to realize aspirations, to satisfy needs, and to change or cope with the environment. Health is, therefore, seen as a resource for everyday life, not the objective of living. It's a good one.
Oh, it's so good. Like, why? What really just resonates with you about it?
Well, I think a lot of what personally resonated with me was that idea of health is a resource for living, not the objective. And I think that is exactly had been my experience. Before, it was like my objective for living. That was what I was pursuing is health, right? Now I just see it as, every day I want to feel my best because I see it as a resource for living a meaningful life.
But it's not the actual, like, this is the reason I'm alive, is to pursue this health thing. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, and I also love about this quote is it obviously the World Health Organization is talking about the needs of the world's health, right? Like all the world's inhabitants.
Not just the privileged.
Exactly. Yeah. I think our current nutrition culture really creates privilege in so many ways. And when we really look at what health is, it should be it's a need. It's a basic need for any individual to really reach and have as a resource for living a meaningful life. And orthorexia might be a good example, or just this preoccupation with health can keep us from that.
Right. And in the quote, it says that for us to be healthy, we must be able to realize aspirations. So, does that have anything to do with like what we put in our mouth? No, the things that we put in our mouth maybe will enable us to be able to have our basic needs met so that we're able to do things beyond that, kind of in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's not like you can become self-actualized or reach those aspirations that you have or those goals that you have if you aren't fed. But that's sort of, to me, speaking to this idea of like, part of what's important to our health is us being able to do what makes us feel fulfilled, Right. They also say to satisfy needs. Okay, well, one of our needs is to eat. One of our needs is to stay warm and to go to the bathroom and to have a place to lay down to sleep at night. And to change or cope with the environment. I think that's another really important kind of aspect of what makes us healthy and functional and feel good. And it's just interesting how they don't say they need the proper amounts of carbohydrate, fat, and protein, and they need just enough, folic acid, or just they're not getting specific about like nutrition is the ultimate, path to salvation with health.
Right. And I would, it actually, cope with the environment to me means that we're building resiliency physically and mentally. Right.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And the way that I tied it into this eating competence is, for someone to be a competent eater, they really need ongoing, reliable access to satisfying foods. So like foods that they enjoy. Right. And so, if we have that as the base, if we've been able to satisfy that needs, which oftentimes can not be the reality for individuals, particularly in the work that we do with disordered eating, right, and self-imposed restrictions and whatnot. So if they're able to get there, then yes, they can realize aspirations. They can satisfy those needs. They can live a higher purpose, and they can, like I said, live a meaningful life.
And that's the purpose of food and nutrition, is to enable you to do that, not to be the ultimate, reason for living. And even though you and I do this professionally, I think we can both speak to that. Like, and this really ties into what we want to talk about next. Like, food is important to us. Nutrition is important to us, but there's also this fine line you have to walk where it's not too important.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
talk about your thoughts on that. I love this concept. And I think that this can be a very practical, hopefully a practical conversation for people to be able to take away some tools in how to care about their eating and their health, but how to strike that balance where it's not obsessive and rigid, but it's also not completely just a free-for-all that doesn't really enable them to feel their best, you know?
Definitely. Well, the interesting thing about this, and you'd probably agree, like my fundamental food philosophy is that as human beings, we actually have the ability to self-moderate somewhere in that gray area. It just is that we don't have the practice when we're living with this black and white mindset about food that is really taught culturally. We're either on or off or good or bad or however we want to label it. But essentially, I think that we can get to a place where we naturally self-moderate with food without a bunch of rules. And so, yes, we don't not care, but we also don't care too much. And it's I think it's a really hard frame of mind to describe unless you've experienced it, to get to a point where, yeah, I think about it, but I don't really think about it. I care about it, but I don't really care about it.
I know
it's important to me, but it's not important to me. Yeah. It feels really hard to describe, but it is possible. And it's actually how I would describe making peace with food. That's where you would get. So we can do it. It just takes some practice. And I think a big issue that keeps us stuck in the black and white mindset and away from this natural self-moderation is the judgment we have about food and the judgment we have about ourselves with the foods that we're eating, right? So if it's good or bad, if we're good or bad, healthy or unhealthy even, is just not helpful. Just the way that we classify foods is keeping us stuck often and away from that natural ability.
I totally agree. So your fundamental thought is we are capable of striking this balance, but a lot of us don't have practice in it, and it's pretty not culturally normal to strike this balance. And so you have a lot of things kind of working against you, but in the end, you can trust that you'll find this. And it is really difficult to describe to people. Let's take a stab at it. How would you do your best to describe what this balance kind of looks like?
Yeah, I think gentle nutrition is a good way to describe it for sure. And that actually was my point in this blog post, is that gentle nutrition is the 10th principle for a reason. We wait until last because, quite honestly, talking about nutrition for someone who is in the diet mindset or is easily triggered by nutrition talk, it's not helpful. And so there's often a lot of healing that needs to be done before we can truly get to this place where we care without caring. I think a good way, so gentle nutrition might be a way. I kind of like to think about it in terms of, I heard this quote once, I can't even remember where it was, so I'm sorry to whoever said it. But it's about, it says it's about being good, or it's about feeling good, not being good. And so taking that morality out of it, I'm not trying to be good with food. I'm just trying to fuel myself well, to feel my best. And
love that.
There is so much flexibility in that. Like, that's what I want people to know, is when you're fueling to feel good, there's so much flexibility in that. These we're taking into account physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual health, all these different arenas, right? To feel our best, we're feeling to feel good. And so to me, it feels a lot like self-care, more so than like maybe even gentle nutrition. It's kind of just like, what do I, connecting with what I need right now versus what I was doing yesterday or what I'm going to do tomorrow, or, kind of being in the moment with what you actually need. So a lot of that is, checking in and connecting regularly with yourself and recognizing what your needs might be. So
yeah, I like that distinction. It can be so hard for people who want, like, okay, well, how do I integrate the knowledge I have about nutrition science? How do I do that without getting rigid? Because it's just not the way that, anybody really talks about nutrition, except for maybe people in our realm who are working with people day in, day out, and we know kind of
Mm-hmm.
this gentle sort of way to discuss it. It's so, I mean, every article people read, the conversations that people have with each other, it just can be so easy to kind of like just feel confused and almost defeated in how to like care about their health without not letting that get too far, you know?
You bet. And I think, so here's another way that I often describe it. So when we're stuck in that restriction chaos diet cycle, that black and white thinking, the kind of all or nothing, we're usually either motivated by guilt or deprivation, right, on either end of that. So on the restriction side, we're usually motivated by deprivation, which can lead to adaptive behaviors that lead to chaos or overeating or binging. And then, of course, we're motivated by guilt back to restriction, because we're feeling guilty about our behaviors. I actually think we don't want to be motivated by either guilt or deprivation, because neither of them are going to lead to healthy behaviors around food. Instead, if we can really embrace this idea of satisfaction, I think we're actually well on our way to finding that middle ground. Because the way that I would classify satisfaction is I feel well nourished and energized and balanced after eating. I feel like I can get up and go live a meaningful life for 3 or 4 or so hours until I get hungry again, and then I repeat, right? But it doesn't leave me preoccupied. It doesn't leave me second guessing or obsessive. I get up, I push away from the table, and I go live my life. And so oftentimes, like from a practical standpoint, when I work with clients, we really do work to understand, like, what is it? Like, where is that sweet spot of satisfaction where you feel well nourished and satisfied? And what combinations of food might help with that? And know that it can be different at different times of day. It's going to be different for people. But just to start recognizing how food, is helping, it is, as we talked about, is it helping you realize aspirations? Is it leading to productivity and helping you feel more capable? And are we being too rigid and that's not happening, right? So maybe a way to think about it.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. And then another thing that I really loved about your article about this was this idea that you build that confidence with your ability to feed yourself one meal at a time. And this is something I talk about a lot with my clients too, where it's like, it's so common for us to kind of like hover over our life and kind of really feel anxious about, 2 weeks from now, or, oh, how am I ever going to recover? It's such a big task. It's so overwhelming. Or, oh, I'm so mad at myself for yesterday. We kind of like do that rather than like, really all we have is like the here and now. And that sounds cliche, but it's just true. Like, we have this meal, this moment. How can I feel myself in a way that nourishes me, satisfies me, makes me feel great, energizes me, or, really hits on a need that I have right now. And so let's just elaborate a little bit on that idea of like this one meal at a time is really how recovery and life like functions,
Yes, it's a difficult concept, but such an important one. And it may even feel simplistic to the individual who wants to know, how things add up for the rest of the week, right? But it's so true. I love that point, Paige, where all we can do is kind of come back to where we are. What do I need? What sounds good? What sounds satisfying? What do I have available to me? Like, what is my current situation, and how can I make, a choice I feel good about right now?
Not being good.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And how do I do that? And not do that based on what I did yesterday or what I'm going to do tomorrow. Because I think that's the natural inclination. Like, well, I have to balance what I had for breakfast or what I ate last night right now, or I have to, I'm going on vacation this weekend, so I'm going to do, this right now. It really is about connecting with where you are right now, and really learning that. I like to talk about creating values around food, or creating meaningful experiences around food based on your experiences, not on rules or what someone's told you that your experience should be, but what is actually my experience? Because if someone tells me that I should not eat sugar, That doesn't really translate well to my experiences because I know that I can absolutely eat sugar in the grand scheme of things and feel just fine and probably actually be healthier for it. So, like, learning to kind of filter through some of those messages that we're inundated with to know, well, that's just not true for me. You tell me to take out dairy, but I actually really, really feel satisfied by it. And I love the flavor or whatever it adds to whatever. And so I'm going to keep eating it. So we have to be able to filter that through our own experiences. And in order to do that, we have to actually be mindful of those experiences.
And you have to trust yourself too.
Totally,
right? So in order to be able to do that, you have to trust in your own wisdom and you kind of have to stand in your own truth, because chances are really high that you're surrounded by a bunch of people who aren't doing it that way, who aren't trusting or who are comparing or talking about dieting and weight loss and blah, blah, blah all the time. So this is where a lot of my clients will tell me, oh, it all makes sense when I'm talking to you, but then I go and do my regular life and I just get sucked back into some of these things. So yeah, but you can build that confidence and that trust, by just reminding yourself, like, the here and now is what I have. And I'm just going to do the best thing for me right now. And if I happen to fall short of that, like if I made a choice that, gosh, I didn't eat quite enough, or, oh, that really wasn't satisfying or whatever, or I don't feel super great from that, we can learn from that and move on too, right? There's as part of the process is figuring out kind of what works for you. Another thing I like about this idea of like the one meal at a time and like trying to just do the best you can with the here and now is the idea of it really elevates you above this idea of good food and bad food. It gives you the space to be able to say, well, what's good for me right now? Because I can think of lots of different situations where the very same food in different situations can be really good for a person or really not a great choice. So an example would be like a salad. Let's say in some situations, a salad is a horrible choice because it's maybe not enough food for you. Let's say you just finished a really like a race or a hike, or you just happen to be really hungry that day or that meal. Like that might not really do it for you, right? So so this idea of good and bad and right and wrong and should and shouldn't with food is just so silly, because it really depends on what's right for you in the moment. And so thinking that way can help you elevate yourself and above this idea of good and bad food, and just to be able to say, well, what's good for me right now? And sometimes it's candy on Halloween with your kids because that's the right choice, So right. It's just not as black and white as we like to make it seem.
Yeah, and that brings up a good point. I mean, you probably hear this too. So many clients are like, well, Emily, I'm sure I'm not needing ice cream, right? like I'm not needing it. But what I hear in that comment is just the fear and lack of trust and lack of confidence and judgment for what we've already decided is the right choice. So if we can clear out that whatever baggage we're bringing to that meal and remember that we're just connecting with where we are and what feels like it will be adequate and nourishing and satisfying, then we can make a completely wise choice. And I actually was thinking of that exact example, like going into a restaurant knowing that you're really hungry and what sounds the best is a cheeseburger and you order the salad. I would actually say it's not the right choice, It just wasn't the right thing for you, even though on paper it might have felt like the right thing. And so
how many people have gone out to a dinner and ordered the salad when they really wanted the pasta or whatever else, and then ended up coming home and eating all the cookies because you're like, I wasn't satisfied. I actually have experienced that myself, and I've had clients say similar things where they, it's just very interesting how when we move beyond this right and wrong attitude around food, we can really make the choices that are best for us based on what we really need. And you know what? I'm here to say sometimes that might be a salad, and that's okay too, but it's not always, it's not that easy just to say, oh, it's always the salad is the right choice.
Well, and yeah, I think that's important to recognize, especially in this topic of caring without caring. It can go either way. that's the point. There's not the wrong or right. It's just connecting with where you are. So maybe the salad is what sounds best at the time, but that's not a point to pat yourself on the back. Just like when you order the cheeseburger is not the point where you hit yourself over the head. It's just the choice for the moment, and we move on.
And it doesn't say anything about your morality, who you are, your status.
Nutritional status.
Exactly. Yes. Exactly. And
yes.
this is I just wish our culture was more like this, because it would be way more fun to eat out with people. You know, if you literally could order the pizza and not have everyone be like, ooh, what does this mean? Or, you know, if you order the salad, not have everyone think, oh, of course you do. You know, it's just like, I just wish we could move beyond this.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that our clients would feel less pressure, right? And better able to connect with their innate wisdom if that was the possibility. That's what makes us hard, as you brought up earlier. And I may just comment on that quickly. I think this is why it's so important to stay really connected with these non-diet messages regularly each day, like really setting aside like 30 minutes, finding some way to stay connected, because, you know, you might spend an hour in our office every week, but that's just not enough time to really fuel you for the next 7 days. And so like podcast listening, for example, is great. Like to just find ways to just connect with this message, to keep you connected with your goals, to keep you connected with what you're valuing, to remind yourself what you're doing, because it's easy to get sucked back into that mentality the minute you go out to eat with someone, or the minute you hear the latest news about XYZ, you know. So
very true. Yeah. And that's actually why I do this podcast, is because I am, you know, I really feel strongly that people need these messages and deserve, you know, a voice of reason in the really crazy world we live in with food. And I'm so appreciative of people like you who make it possible. So thank you for being here. Did you want to say anything else about this caring without caring idea? Do you feel like we covered it, or anything else?
I hope we did. I hope that people are leaving with the mindset that it's possible, that they can get to a point where they care about their health without it feeling so worrisome. I would just, the only thing I would add maybe is, well, I think we probably kind of hit on it, but just focus on what you're doing. I mean, that's the whole point. If we can kind of clear out all of that other garbage and just listen to our own innate wisdom, we can get there. So.
And really try to avoid the tendency that we have to compare, and be mindful when that's kind of coming into your consciousness, and just maybe just let it go, you know, and just say, yeah, she's doing that, I'm doing this, that's fine.
Yeah, and maybe even using it as the opportunity to reconnect with your story, why you're doing what you're doing. You know, like it could be an opportunity to actually strengthen this ability to care without caring if you are reconnecting with why you're doing what you're doing, why you're practicing what you're practicing. Whether they're doing whatever elimination diet they're doing does not mean that what they're doing is right for you. And to create that distinction for yourself, I think will be huge.
Oh, Emily, that's so beautifully said. I love that. This has been such a great conversation, and I'm really, really excited to publish it. So thanks for being here.
Me too. Yeah, thank you.
Take a few minutes to just talk about how people can keep in touch with you and your blog and all of that.
Sure. So my website is emilyfonsbeck.com. I'll spell that. It's FONNESBECK. So emilyfonsbeck.com. I blog there. And then also I'm on Pinterest, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Emily Fonsbeck. And I'd love to connect with you there.
Great. Great. Okay. And I'll post links to all of that as well. Is there anything else you wanted to say before we end?
No, I am just have really enjoyed our conversation. Really hope it's helpful to the listeners. So
me too.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thanks so much for being here, Emily.
Well, I sincerely hope you've enjoyed this conversation. If you haven't already, please go ahead and leave a review on iTunes. Thanks again so much for listening, and we'll see you soon for another episode.